Marcia is off tonight. An ongoing investigation into a St. Tammany Parish work release program took a strange and disturbing twist this week. Elsewhere, more lawsuits alleging church-related sexual abuse have been filed. In politics, former Governor Kathleen Blanco delivered an important message in what might be her last public speech, and we'll look at the political differences between Louisiana's two Republican senators. We'll also examine the church crisis from the perspective of a journalist who's covered it from the early days, and we'll hear about his book that examines the city's history. Joining us are tonight's informed sources: Jason Berry, freelance journalist and author; Stephanie Grace, political columnist for the New Orleans Advocate; Katie Moore, investigative reporter for WWL-TV Channel 4; and Ramon Vargas, reporter for the New Orleans Advocate. And Katie, we'll start with you. You've been on the show a few times lately talking about this ongoing investigation in the St. Tammany Sheriff's Office, the former sheriff. And for most of the time, this looked like some kind of a kickback scheme.
Right.
If all the allegations prove true, and indeed it might be. But boy, it took a strange twist this week.
It certainly did. It certainly did. You know, we found out actually from the current sheriff just yesterday that some of the new allegations about the former sheriff may have started with this corruption probe that's going on, obviously, in federal court involving former Sheriff Jack Strain and his two top deputies, two of his closest friends from his days when he was in Abita Springs. And now we're hearing that from our sources that at least 4 people have made allegations about alleged sexual abuse involving Strain. And so, you know, this is, I don't think, something that any of us expected when we started covering this 5 years ago. We just started looking into problems with the work release, these questionable contracts that had been given out by Strain, which were no-bid contracts to people who were his good friends and the children of his good friends. And, we started from that angle and the public safety angle and the fact that this was something that appeared to have some questionable elements to it. And I don't think that we ever anticipated these types of questionable elements.
No, there hasn't been any formal legal action taken against Strain yet.
No.
But from the reporting, it seems like that the reporters are getting a lot of confirmation from various sources that something happened.
Absolutely. Our partners at The Advocate were obviously integral. Ramon played a huge role in this story this week. Sarah Pagonis, Gordon Russell, all of us kind of working to try and get confirmation on this. This is obviously not something that you report lightly. This is something that you think about quite a bit before you actually go with it. And you better make sure that you have it nailed down, because it's not like somebody can go back from even accusations like this. So we've been working diligently to try and make sure that this was all, tied up with a bow, I guess, before we went with it.
And these were teenagers who may or may not have been at the age of consent, is
Correct.
that right?
Yes. There are questions about when these things happened still that we don't know. There are questions about if they were underage at the time, meaning under age 17. Mm-hmm. But what we are hearing from those sources is that most of these people were teenagers around the time of these alleged incidents.
And were they all working for the work release program?
No, 2 of them, according to our sources, were employed at the work release program. But the other 2 are allegations from people outside. The other 2 are a boy and a girl. We know that much. But that's about all that we're reporting at this point.
Does this seem to be one of these things that a lot of people knew about but were just keeping quiet?
I don't think so. I think that there is a very tight-knit group of people who have known about these allegations, and I think that has been the case for quite some time. There have been rumors about other things involving Strain of a sexual nature, but those are things that never really went anywhere.
Now, if this case develops, it'll be the state court that'll be found. It'll be the district attorney's office.
Right.
And not the federal government, even though they have been doing a lot of the spade work on this.
Well, the federal government, obviously is involved in the corruption part of this probe. They've already filed charges in this bill of information that was really a roadmap for how this scheme allegedly worked between Strain and his top deputies. And so the feds will very likely, all indications are, file charges against Jack Strain for those things. And then you have this separate part of this, which the sex charges, as far as we can tell, would fit better in state court. And then we're hearing from Sheriff Smith yesterday that St. Tammany Parish DA Warren Montgomery's office has actually met with the FBI his office would not confirm whether or not they're working on the investigation, but the sex part of this, the sexual allegations part of this, would fit most likely in state court.
You grew up in St. Tammany in Slidell, right? Okay.
I did,
Does this
yeah.
surprise you? I mean,
Yeah.
to see the St. Tammany has such a wholesome image, and you've seen the district attorney, past district attorney, past coroner, past sheriff getting in this kind of trouble.
Right, absolutely, it sure does. I mean, you know, we had Raphael Goyeneche even a couple of weeks ago, whenever the top deputies were charged, he said this is the trifecta of law enforcement. I mean, these are the top law enforcement officers of St. Tammany Parish, St. Slamony. I mean, we're hearing that a lot from people on social media. Like, this gives a new meaning to criminal justice in St. Tammany Parish. And it's shocking to a lot of people. And I think, you know, it's a real sign that people want accountability and they want answers and they want to get rid of this sort of good old boy network that I think has been in place there for decades.
Now, the original charge is the one for which there was the bill of information last week. Where does that stand now?
They made their first appearance in court this week. We're talking about David Hansen Sr. and Clifford Skip Keene, both of whom had children who owned the company that was this Slidell work release program. And they both pleaded not guilty in court, but they were charged in a bill of information, which many of us know have covered anything in federal court, that's an indication that they're going to plead guilty.
Okay. Well, interesting but disturbing story.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Ramon, you've been covering another interesting but disturbing story. The stories about the sexual scandals. You've done a lot of the breakthrough work recently in covering it. And this week, you reported on at least a couple of lawsuits. One against one of the priests, the Salesian priests. Now, they were the ones who operated at Hope Haven, weren't they? And this particular priest, I don't think, did. But they also are involved in one of the high schools. And there is someone who's filed a lawsuit against them.
Yes, and that Salesian priest was not on the list of 57 credibly accused clergy that was released November 2nd by the Archdiocese. So this would mean this lawsuit is I guess breaking ground on new allegations. And it wasn't just any Salesian priest; it was the guy who ran the personnel in a region from New York extending down to Louisiana. So he's a pretty high-ranking priest, and really it's the watered down. It's essentially a teenage orderly who was taking care of a Salesian brother. Was assaulted in a closet.
He was offered a job taking care of his brother. Yes,
taking care of a brother, and then assaulted while working in a closet, according to the lawsuit. Really, and it was the latest kind of legal salvo in a series of kind of legal attacks on the Catholic Church locally. You know, they said the administration, Archbishop Gregory Amon's administration, I guess, said that, you know, they didn't fear the consequences of disclosing a list, and you know, there was reason to think that could step up the pace of lawsuits, or certainly not stop lawsuits that kind of predated the release of that list. And I think you've been seeing that with the Salesian lawsuit that we just discussed. There was another one against a former deacon who's been revealed to be a suspected serial child abuser by the name of George Brignac. There was a lawsuit, I think, filed the day before the Salesian lawsuit that we've been discussing. And then that was on, you know, I guess it remains to be seen. I think a week ago from today, there was the Jesuit order released their own list of credibly accused clergy and religious brothers, I guess, in the region that includes New Orleans. You know, there's been some debates about how complete that list was, same as the Archdiocese. So we'll see. And what that list did was really confirm the status of some figures that were in the middle of the lawsuit involving Richard Windman, who claimed had a very detailed sexual assault claim centering on Jesuit High School's campus. So it included the name of the priest that he said abused him, as well as in reporting that, there were some other cases that we uncovered that had been quite kind of settled without really much publicity, and those members were on there. So it remains to be seen what legal action stems from that release from a week ago.
And the Salesian Order was started around the turn of the 20th century, and it was started as it sounded good at the time, to help young men who were affected negatively by the Industrial Revolution, when you had all these hard, long hours and factory jobs, and so they were trying to take care of these men.
Yes, and absolutely. And then locally, I guess it meant a lot of their presence centers on Hope Haven and Madonna Manor, which of course has been the center of many alleged atrocities and sexual assault, both sexual and physical abuse, and it was at the center of a $5 million lawsuit in 2009. So I guess, and this certainly expands the scope of the allegations surrounding the order and its presence in New Orleans. Okay.
Well, Jason, you've been covering the story for a long time. I mean, you're sort of at the international level in terms of the press corps that's been following the story. So what you've seen in the last few weeks, what are your thoughts on this? Is this, I mean, it's very sad, but is there anything that's encouraging that you see from this, or
Well, I don't know about encouraging. I think what's happening is that so much of the information that came out in California during the long litigation of the early 2000s is now coming out in other parts of the country, largely because of the scathing grand jury report that was released in Pennsylvania several months ago, and the fact that the Justice Department has now given orders to dioceses across the country that they should by no means destroy any of their files. We don't know whether the government prosecutors on a national level are going to be aggressive on this or not, but that has never happened before. You know, just to echo something Ramon said, the Salesians had enormous exposure in the California cases that were settled in 2007, I think well into the millions, high millions. And there are databases that certain law firms have kept, and bishopaccountability.org now specializes in, which really do raise hard questions about how these religious orders were governed. Alternatively, if you look at the cases at Jesuit High School in New Orleans, as disturbing as they are to read about, I guess the question that lingers for most people, since the church, to its credit, has done a pretty good job of preventing these kinds of cases, these kinds of abuses in recent years. Much of what we're seeing now dates back, some of it even decades. But what's troubling is that we still don't have full information. Just to cite one example, Donald Pierce was the prefect of discipline and president of Jesuit when I went there. There's been a lot of email traffic among guys in my class, and I'm sure other classes. People who were not harmed by him, but naturally have questions. I believe in one of your pieces you said that he had faced multiple claims. Well, I think the province really should release a detailed account as much as they can and say, all right, these are the terrible mistakes that happened. We're doing everything we can. Now we want to move on. But as long as the information drips out piecemeal, it just plants more question marks.
Between Katie's story about a sheriff, about their allegations, and priests, do you see a common denominator here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, the first time that I ever heard the word pedophile was in 1985, when I was doing the very first stories in Lafayette. And Life magazine, I remember, did a big take at the end of '84 on child sexual abuse. Nothing like this was on anyone's national radar screen at that time. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of delayed reaction of the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where people thought that freedom was just another name for nothing left to lose, to cite the song.
That's a good line. Yeah,
well, I know. Maybe I could make some money as a songwriter. But, you know, Errol, these are buried sociological patterns that are slowly surfacing. In the church, absolutely. It's hard to confront that. But it happens in society as well. And people in power who prey on the vulnerable, whether it is children or, as we've seen from the Me Too movement and what's going on at CBS, of women who, have made accusations against the guy who ran 60 Minutes and Moonves, the head of the network. It is a power dynamic that becomes warped. And I don't think as a society we fully come to terms with it. But we have to respect people who have been laboring in anonymity for many years and are coming forward, even if someone, i.e. a priest, is a person who was close to you or your family and you can't imagine it. I would hope the days of circling the wagons, though, have ended.
Right. Well, imagine if it's the sheriff.
Right.
A priest is bad enough, and imagine if it's the top law enforcement officer in your world.
And you see this all over. You see coaches, it's always, so often it's this
Power.
person in the position of authority, moral authority in some cases, and somebody young and vulnerable.
Indeed.
Jason, let me ask you a question. It requires a long answer, but we've only got a few seconds, okay? Do you think the
That's
church...
a good question, Errol.
Do you think the church will ever allow marriages?
Yeah, I do. I think it's inevitable. I don't know whether it will come under this pope, but the clerical culture itself is under such a microscope now. And but before there can be any sort of true revival of what was once a revered priesthood, they're going to have to open ministry to married men, and I believe inevitably to women.
Okay. Well, Stephanie, this is a rare show where it's refreshing to start talking about politics.
Now for something completely different, yes.
You did a column this week comparing Louisiana's two Republican senators, who we always see as being colleagues and friends,
Right.
and I think they are, but there have been differences in voting lately.
It's interesting. So the context is Congress is really at a mad dash to finish its business by the end of the year when the new Congress takes over and everything kind of resets. So there were some big bills outstanding, and John Kennedy and Bill Cassidy have come out on opposite sides of some of them, which is pretty unusual. In Congress, in the Senate certainly, most Republicans tend to stick together. When there are outliers, it's usually Susan Collins of Maine or Jeff Flake, who's now leaving, of Arizona. You don't really hear about Louisiana's senators being on the fence or swing votes on things. But in these two cases, one is a big farm bill that just passed, and another one is the big criminal justice bill that is still in process, and many people hope it will pass by the end of the year. Bill Cassidy is a yes, John Kennedy a no. And there's an ideological element to both of these. With the Farm Bill, again, it had tremendous Republican supports. It handles all things agricultural. It's very wide-ranging. A lot of people in the state depend on it. Ralph Abraham, the Republican congressman who's now running for governor, was very involved. He's from an agricultural district in the northeast part of the state. But the hang-up, one of the hang-ups has been there was an effort by conservative Republicans to use this bill to add work requirements for people who get food stamps, SNAP benefits. And again, it's a very ideological thing. Republicans have controlled Congress all this time. They're about to not control the House. This is their chance. And there was a real effort to put this in the bill. It didn't make it into the final form of the bill. It didn't have enough support. John Kennedy said, I can't support it for that reason, that one reason. Bill Cassidy said, it has all these other good things, and I'm in fact proud to support it, and here are some amendments of mine that help rural people, and not even just in agriculture, but in medicine. So again, it's a very wide-ranging bill. So you had these two statements that came out the same day, one very proud to support it, one very hostile and focusing on something very narrow and ideological. That's John Kennedy. On the criminal justice bill, this is similar to what Louisiana passed last year with, and this is an issue where you really get a lot of bipartisan support with a few outliers. And John Kennedy was one of the outliers in the state at level 2. We're talking about prison reform. We're talking about efforts to reduce mass incarceration, let people who are convicted of nonviolent crimes out early, things like that. And it's something that, religious conservatives support, the Koch brothers support, a lot of Democrats support, President Trump supports. President Trump has actually worked with John Bel Edwards on this issue. So the Senate is trying to pass this, and there's a lot of Republican support, but there's some Republican resistance. Mitch McConnell made a big deal about finally bringing it to a vote. John Kennedy is out there trying to fight it. Meanwhile, Bill Cassidy announced that he's supporting it, and again, proud to support it. And I just think it's interesting because they do often vote in lockstep, and they are maybe not personally close, but politically close, but they really sometimes do have different philosophies. And John Kennedy, I just think, is a much more confrontational person by nature. Bill Cassidy sometimes, not always, looks for ways to be more of a problem solver. And it's interesting to kind of see that unfold in unusual circumstances.
But Kennedy still has those folksy expressions.
He does.
And the one this week, I forget what it was in reference to a certain vote, and he says this is worse than 4 heart attacks and a stroke.
I think it involved Trump. I know that. I forget. You kind of forget what he's talking about versus what the saying is. Sometimes it's hard to match
The
them up.
urinating on the leg of the taxpayer, was that one of them recently?
Oh boy, I missed that one. Okay.
Yeah, pretty good. Medicaid.
Jason, you have a book that's come out this year about that's the tricentennial book, and it's about City of a Million Dreams. And in it, the approach you use, instead of doing a straight historical narrative, is that you looked at the culture and the history and the music, but you did it through several characters in the book, and so it's a delightful way. I'd like to just point out 2 of them, and one of them being a clergyman, I thought it'd become appropriate, and that's Père Antoine. Tell us about the significance of Père Antoine.
Yeah, well, the argument of the book is that the city's beguiling personality is the product of a long tension between a culture of spectacle and a city of laws, in which the culture kept pushing the officialdom to change the laws. It sort of begins with Congo Square and the slave dances. Père Antoine was an amazing figure, and as we've been talking about the church, think about a guy who comes from Spain in the late 18th century, comes to New Orleans as a secret agent of the Spanish Inquisition. And
well, he was a priest.
He was a priest.
Right?
He was a Capuchin, yes, which is a division of the Franciscans. So he comes here and is flexing his muscles of authority and gets into a conflict with Governor Miraut over whether he would have the authority with armed soldiers to go at will into the homes of any citizens of the city to basically inspect their libraries, to see if any of these French planners were reading, the poisoned tracts of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau and so forth. Well, he was promptly put on a ship and sent back to Spain. Miraut wanted nothing to do with him. And then he came back in 1795. He won a reprieve from the King of Spain and established himself as the most popular pastor, arguably in the city's history, and one of the most popular citizens. He would marry almost anyone. He flaunted church law. He
performed the ceremony of marriage.
Exactly. He would, non-Catholics to marry Catholics, fine, come on in. I'm willing to do it. He's really an extraordinary figure. He was involved with the Lafitte brothers, the pirates. He, at one point, was a spy for the Spanish. He was getting a pension to provide intelligence after the Louisiana Purchase.
Okay, let me ask quickly about one other person, as you mentioned, Sister Gertrude Morgan.
My favorite in the book. Sister Gertrude Morgan, of course, is a famous a painter, a folk artist who was present at the creation of Preservation Hall. And she was represented by Larry Borenstein, the art dealer, who could have stepped out of central casting. I mean, he was thrown in jail 3 times in Mexico for trying to ferret antiquities out of the country. And his daughter helped me very graciously, let me quote some of the love letters that he wrote to her mother. Both the parents are deceased. But what's so interesting about Gertrude Morgan is that she was a mystic. She was like William Blake or Catherine of Siena, believing that she was in direct contact with God, and her paintings reflect it. So she's there in the middle of the freedom marches, the civil rights movement, the freedom riders, the revival of jazz, and she's painting these otherworldly scenes of the New Jerusalem, the heavenly city, conquering the world of evil.
So on top of everything, we're also a city of mystics, you can say that. So.
I don't know how many other mystics there are, Errol, but a city of saints and sinners, shall we say.
Okay. You had a column, a very touching column this week about former Governor Kathleen Blanco. Gave a speech last week and admitted that she was had cancer and that it had pretty much taken over her body. But she also had a message to the state. You want to talk about this?
It was so interesting. This is at the Council for a Better Louisiana cable. They have an annual lunch, and they gave Kathleen Blanco an award that basically a career honoring her long service. Her whole family was there. She stood up to give a speech, and you don't necessarily think of her as a compelling speaker, but this was something. She, for one thing, she talked about her cancer. She's been diagnosed with ocular melanoma. It has spread. It's spread through her body. She knows there's no cure. She's facing it head on. I mean, it was a real profile and courage to hear her talk about it and her faith, and just really know that, the way she put it, the monster is down the road. It's not far. We know it's coming. That said, she looked well and she sounded well, and it was great to see her. And she did have a message. And this is, people wondered, we may not hear her in a situation like this again. We don't know. But if this is the last time she gives a public speech, her message is education, education, education. Education is how you fight poverty. Education is how you give people opportunity, and you got to pay for it. You don't get more with less. And specifically, she was talking about teacher pay raises. If you remember her tenure, one of her proudest achievement was they brought Louisiana teachers up to the Southern average, and of course they've since fallen back. And there's going to be an effort this coming spring to raise teacher pay again. And she basically said, this is the most important thing you can do for the state and for the people.
Of course, she wanted to be the education governor.
She did. She ended up being the Katrina governor,
Had it not been for
unfortunately.
Katrina, which just really interrupted everything, she might have been remembered as a great education governor.
And I think she somewhat is. I think
Okay.
people are looking back and really recognizing that
Let's
now.
go around quickly. What should we be looking for in the near future? Jason?
There's a book called Educated by a young woman named Tara Westover about her hard Scrabble origins in a Mormon family on top of a mountain. It has gotten extraordinary reviews. She now has a doctorate from Cambridge. It is really one of the finest memoirs I've read in a long time, and my bet is that it will win one of the prizes coming up.
Okay. Stephanie?
Starting next week, the City Council is going to be diving back into short-term rental regulation, Airbnb. Huge issue in the campaign. They have some proposed legislation that really maybe restricts things much more than they're restricted now. It's going to be a really interesting debate.
Right. Katie?
I'm working on alt strain all the time right now. I think it's highly likely that we'll see some more stories coming out next week, some more news breaking out of that whole situation, whether that's the corruption side of it or these sex abuse allegations. There's still much, much more to come.
Okay. And Ramon?
We'll be taking a look at encouraging violent crime numbers in New Orleans. There's been a drop in significant categories, and we'll be taking a look at what some steps the police took during the time that those numbers fell.
Have you talked to the Archbishop since he released that list a few weeks ago, or have you got any reactions from the Archdiocese?
Not on the record.
Okay. But it seemed like it was a good effort, at least on their part, as far as we can tell.
Yes, I mean, I think they kept to their word that they did not fear they did not fear any possible legal consequences, i.e., more lawsuits and putting it out. They put it out because the Archbishop and his brain trust believed it was the right thing to do.
Okay, and Stephanie, real quick, any new front runner in the next year's governor's race?
I don't think so. Right now we have two Republicans, Eddie Risponi and Ralph Abraham. Sharon Hewitt said she'll decide pretty soon. She's a state senator from Slidell. That may be it.
Okay. Well, thanks to all of you for watching. Enjoy the season. Maybe we all have happier news next week, and see you next time. Bye-bye.